Have you ever wondered how a young boy, stripped of his family, his identity, and his freedom, could rise to become the second most powerful man on earth? How does a favorite son, betrayed by his own flesh and blood and sold for the price of a common slave, find the strength to resist the most powerful temptations in a foreign land? What is the true meaning of dreams that foretell the rise and fall of nations, and how can one man hold the keys to the world's survival during an apocalypse? And perhaps most importantly, when faced with the brothers who shattered his life, would he choose revenge or the most profound act of forgiveness in history? These are not just questions of the past. They are inquiries into the very heart of human resilience, faith, and the divine destiny that shapes our world. In this video, we will uncover the epic, sweeping narrative of the Patriarch Joseph, a story of betrayal and redemption, of pits and palaces, and of a God whose plan weaves through the darkest chapters of human history to bring about an unimaginable good. Prepare to journey from the grazing fields of Canaan to the golden courts of ancient Egypt as we explore a life that reads like the greatest thriller ever written. Before we descend into this epic saga, if you enjoy deep dives into biblical history and the stories that shaped civilization, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And remember, if any question comes to your mind as we go through Joseph's incredible journey, write it in the comments below. I personally read and reply to all of them. Now let the story begin. The life of the Patriarch Joseph is one of history's most profound epics of rise, fall, and redemption. A story that reads like a masterful thriller of a beloved son whose own flesh and blood turned against him in a fit of jealous rage, a young man stripped of his identity, sold into slavery in a foreign land, and thrown into a dark dungeon for a crime he did not commit. Yet through unwavering faith and divine destiny, climbed out of a pit to become the second most powerful ruler of the greatest empire on earth, ancient Egypt. This narrative explores how a shepherd boy from Canaan came to hold the keys to the world's grain supply during a devastating apocalypse, how he resisted the most powerful temptations, and what happened when the brothers who betrayed him were forced to beg for bread at his feet, not recognizing the prince they once sold for pocket change. We begin our story in the ancient lands of Canaan with the patriarch Jacob, who had 12 sons, the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, but among them one boy. Joseph shone with a different light, born into brilliance and blessed with undeniable beauty and a prophetic gift that manifested in vivid dreams, foretelling a destiny far greater than tending sheep. These gifts, however, were a double-edged sword that sparked a deadly envy in his older brothers, setting into motion a chain of events that would bridge Canaan to the majestic courts of the Egyptian pharaohs, tracing his life from his father's favored tent to the bottom of a dry well, through the slave markets of Egypt, into the dark prisons of Potiphar, and finally, to the golden heights of power. The story starts with favoritism, as Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children, for he was the son of his old age and his beloved wife, Rachel, marking this distinction by gifting Joseph an ornate coat of many colors, a symbol of status and a visible declaration that he was the chosen heir, which caused his brothers' hearts to harden with hatred so that they could not speak a kind word to him. Adding fuel to this fire were Joseph's dreams. In one, he saw 11 bundles of wheat bowing down to his bundle, and in another bolder dream, he saw the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing to him, which, when innocently shared with his family, caused even his father to rebuke him and his brothers' jealousy to turn murderous as they realized these were prophecies of dominion over them. The tipping point arrived in the grazing fields of Dothan, where Jacob sent 17-year-old Joseph to check on his brothers. And upon seeing him approaching with that hated coat shimmering in the sun, the darkness in their hearts took over, leading them to conspire to kill him and throw him into a pit, saying a ferocious animal devoured him to see what would become of his dreams. Reuben the eldest tried to save him by suggesting they throw him alive into a dry well, instead planning to rescue him later, so when Joseph arrived, they brutally stripped him of his colorful robe and cast him into the dark, empty pit, ignoring his cries as they sat down to eat. As they ate, a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants approached, heading toward Egypt, and Judah proposed selling Joseph instead of killing him, asking what they would gain by his death. So for 20 shekels of silver, the price of a common slave, they sold their own flesh and blood, and Joseph, bound and broken, was dragged away toward a strange land. To cover their crime, the brothers took Joseph's coat, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in its blood, and presented this gruesome evidence to their father, Jacob, who recognized it instantly and collapsed in grief, crying out that a ferocious animal had devoured him, refusing to be comforted and mourning for a son who was actually still alive. Joseph arrived in Egypt, a world of towering gods and strange language, where he was purchased on the auction block by Potiphar, the captain of Pharaoh's guard, a high-ranking official. Yet this was not the end for Joseph. As the narrative tells us that the Lord was with him, and even in slavery everything he touched prospered, causing Potiphar to promote him to be in charge of his entire household, making the young Hebrew slave master of an Egyptian estate. However, Joseph was also described as strikingly handsome, which attracted the dangerous attention of Potiphar's wife, who became obsessed with him and attempted to seduce him day after day, whispering for him to come to bed with her. A test far greater than the pit, as he was far from home with no one watching yet. His integrity held firm, and he refused her, asking how he could do this great wickedness and sin against God. One day, when the house was empty, she cornered him and grabbed his garment. But in a desperate escape to preserve his honor, Joseph pulled away, leaving his cloak in her hands and running out of the house. Scorned and furious, Potiphar's wife used that cloak as evidence against him when her husband returned, twisting the story and accusing Joseph of the very crime he refused to commit, causing Potiphar to burn with anger, and though perhaps suspecting the truth, he had to act to save face, so Joseph was thrown into the king's prison, where Pharaoh's prisoners were confined once again in a pit, punished for doing the right thing. The dungeon was dark, but Joseph's light did not fade, for even there, God's favor remained. And the prison warden, seeing Joseph's competence, put him in charge of all the other prisoners. Sometime later, two high-profile inmates arrived, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker, both imprisoned for offending the king, and one night, both men had disturbing, vivid dreams that they could not understand. Seeing their distress the next morning, Joseph asked them why they were sad, and they explained they had dreams with no interpreter, to which Joseph replied, confident in his connection to God, that interpretations belong to God, and asked them to tell him their dreams. The cupbearer described a vine with 3 branches producing grapes, which he squeezed into Pharaoh's cup. Joseph interpreted immediately that in 3 days, Pharaoh would lift up his head and restore him to his position, adding a desperate personal plea for the cupbearer to remember him and mention him to Pharaoh to get him out of prison, explaining he was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews and had done nothing to deserve the dungeon. Emboldened by this positive reading, the baker shared his dream of 3 baskets of bread on his head, which birds were eating. Joseph gave the grim interpretation that in 3 days Pharaoh would lift off his head and impale you on a pole, and the birds would eat his flesh. 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, events unfolded exactly as Joseph predicted. The baker was executed and the cupbearer was restored to his high office, but then we encounter one of the saddest lines in the story. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him, leaving Joseph to rot in prison for 2 more agonizing years as the test of patience continued. 2 full years later, the mighty Pharaoh himself was tormented by nightmares of 7 sleek, fat cows emerging from the Nile, followed by 7 ugly, gaunt cows that devoured the fat ones. And he woke up, slept again, and dreamed of 7 healthy heads of grain being swallowed by 7 thin, scorched heads. None of Egypt's magicians or wise men could interpret these terrifying visions, and the palace was in a state of panic until the cupbearer's memory was finally jogged, and he confessed his fault to Pharaoh, speaking of the young Hebrew in the dungeon who could interpret dreams. Joseph was immediately summoned, shaved, given fresh clothes, and brought before the most powerful man on earth, who told him he had heard that when Joseph hears a dream, he can interpret it. Joseph disclaimed any personal power, replying that he could not do it, but God would give Pharaoh the answer he desires. After hearing the dreams, Joseph revealed the terrifying truth that God was showing Pharaoh the future. The 7 fat cows and healthy grain represented 7 years of extraordinary abundance coming to Egypt, but they would be immediately followed by 7 years of devastating famine so severe that the years of plenty would be forgotten and the land would be ravaged by starvation. Joseph didn't just identify the problem. He offered a solution, advising Pharaoh to appoint a discerning and wise man to oversee the land, collect 1/5 of the harvest during the good years, and store it in reserve for the coming apocalypse. Pharaoh was stunned by the wisdom of this 30-year-old former slave, asking his officials if they could find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God, and turning to Joseph declared that since God had made all this known to him, there was no one so discerning and wise, appointing him to be in charge of his palace and over all his people, only second to the throne. In an instant, Joseph was elevated from a prisoner in rags to the Grand Vizier of Egypt, as Pharaoh placed his own signet ring on Joseph's finger, dressed him in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and had him ride in the second chariot with crowds shouting to make way. The boy in the pit was now the master of the Nile. Joseph spent the next 7 years traveling throughout Egypt, building massive storehouses and gathering grain like the sand of the sea, so much it could not be measured. Then the 7 years came to an end, the skies dried up, the crops failed, and the predicted famine struck not just Egypt, but the entire surrounding region, leaving people starving. But in Egypt, thanks to Joseph, there was bread, and the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, for he was the governor of the land. Back in Canaan, Jacob's family was suffering, and hearing there was grain in Egypt, he sent 10 of his sons, keeping the youngest, Benjamin, Joseph's full brother, safe at home to buy food. The brothers arrived in Egypt, and were brought before the governor, bowing down to him, with their faces to the ground, fulfilling the dream Joseph had decades earlier. Joseph recognized them instantly, but they did not recognize this powerful Egyptian lord, so he decided to test them to see if they had changed or were still the cruel men who sold him. He spoke harshly to them through an interpreter, accusing them of being spies, to which they defended themselves, explaining they were honest men, 12 sons of one father in Canaan. One was no more, and the youngest was with their father. To test their truthfulness, Joseph imprisoned Simeon and sent the other 9 back with grain, under the strict condition that they must return with their youngest brother, Benjamin, to prove their story, also secretly putting their money back into their grain sacks, which caused them panic when they discovered it later. Months passed, the grain ran out, and the brothers had to return to Egypt. But Jacob was terrified to let Benjamin go, fearing he would lose him just as he lost Joseph, and only after Judah pledged his own life for the boy did Jacob agree. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph was overwhelmed with emotion upon seeing his full brother, and had to leave the room to weep before returning, to host a feast for them where he showed favoritism to Benjamin to see if the older brothers would get jealous again. But the final test was yet to come. Joseph ordered his silver cup to be secretly placed in Benjamin's sack, and as the brothers left the city the next morning, Joseph's steward overtook them, accusing them of theft, which they denied vehemently, saying that whoever was found with the cup should die and the rest would become slaves. The search began from the eldest to the youngest, and the tension mounted until the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, causing the brothers to tear their clothes in grief as they were brought back to Joseph. This was the moment of truth. Would they abandon their youngest brother to save themselves, just as they had abandoned Joseph years ago? Judah stepped forward and offered a passionate plea, explaining how the loss of Benjamin would kill their elderly father, and in a supreme act of sacrificial love, Judah offered himself as a slave in Benjamin's place so the boy could return home. The test was complete, as Judah, the brother who once suggested selling Joseph, was now willing to sacrifice his life for his brother, proving they had changed. Joseph could no longer control his emotions and ordered all his Egyptian attendants to leave the room, and alone with his brothers, he broke down in loud, uncontrollable weeping, so loud that the Egyptians outside heard it, and then he spoke the words that sent shockwaves through them. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" His brothers were terrified, speechless, and stunned in his presence. For the powerful Egyptian lord they feared was the brother they had betrayed, and they expected execution. But Joseph beckoned them closer, saying he was their brother Joseph whom they sold into Egypt, telling them not to be distressed or angry with themselves for selling him, because it was to save lives that God sent him ahead of them. He explained the divine perspective that they intended to harm him, but God intended it for good to accomplish the saving of many lives, and he wept over them and kissed them. The news reached Pharaoh, who was pleased and invited Joseph's entire family to move to Egypt, offering them the best of the land, and the brothers returned to Canaan with carts, gifts, and the unbelievable news that Joseph was still alive and ruler over all Egypt. Jacob was stunned and could not believe them until he saw the Egyptian wagons, which revived his spirit, and he declared he was convinced that his son Joseph was still alive and would go and see him before he died. The grand reunion took place in Egypt, where after more than 20 years of grief, a father embraced the son he thought was dead, and the family settled in the fertile land of Goshen, saved from famine by the very brother they had rejected. From a pit of despair to the pinnacle of power, the life of Joseph is a profound testament to the idea that even our darkest moments, our deepest betrayals, and our most unfair circumstances can be woven into a greater plan for good. A story that teaches us about the fortitude of integrity in the face of temptation, the patience required when we feel forgotten, and the incredible power of forgiveness to heal broken families. What part of Joseph's incredible journey resonated most with you? Was it his resilience in prison, his resistance to temptation, or his ability to forgive his brothers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. If you found value in this story, please give the video a thumbs up and share it. We will see you in the next video as we continue to explore the histories that shaped our world.